Yeah, this is our first time doing a simulcast with our campaign and WPAA, which we're super excited to work with these folks who have done a great job for this community and having this space and giving us this opportunity to reach more voters. We're really excited to do this in the middle of our campaign's senior week, which is, we're going kind of taking a next level of focus in terms of really honing in on the certain types of issues and topics that are more pertinent than ever to seniors in Wallingford and our more senior residents. And I think by having WPAA as a partner here helps us reach more people, which is what our campaign's been trying to do from the start. These are questions that people asked beforehand. Either they texted us, they emailed us, or they commented on Facebook. So thank you for doing that. So let's see. So we had two folks ask, I believe it was Keith and Chris on Facebook, ask questions about infrastructure, and specifically infrastructure that needs to be addressed in terms of repairs at town buildings, streets like North Main Street, plan for community pool, and how you're going to bring town hall's technology to date. So I realize there's a lot in there, but it's important, so we're going to talk about it. So infrastructure in general across the town, I think it's become more apparent perhaps than it's ever been before, now that we've had a really dedicated and great group of volunteers in the building maintenance committee, which basically functions as folks who are tasked to the best of their ability to analyze and report on what the infrastructure concerns of our town currently are. So I know they've been to many buildings and parks across town. And the reality is, as someone who's traveled across the state of Connecticut in the past years as part of my job, can tell you that our infrastructure does fall well below not just other towns, but where we as Wallingford should be, most importantly. Our sidewalks are in terrible shape. Our roads could be certainly better. Our town buildings are in terrible shape. And our schools, which I know is another question, so we'll focus more on those after, certainly need a lot of work done as well. In terms of community pool by 2025, that is certainly something that I have committed to. The pool has been, I can barely call it a pool at this point. I mean, it's been out of service for several years, and anyone who's driven by it knows that it's in a dire state. But that is something that should have been done in a perfect world years ago. We waited because some folks in elected leadership in town thought that prices would go down, which is I've yet to been shown in history in the United States when that's ever happened. So now we're paying those consequences. But the pool can be done. It'll be done with a combination of hopefully grant money. It'll be bonded, and it might have to be adjusted slightly in terms of the original plan just because we've waited and costs might have gone up. But I'm certainly committed and have no doubt that we can open that pool in the summer of 2025, at least at some point that summer for residents to use, because it is an important part of this community. And in terms of technology in town hall, that's going to take a bit longer potentially. I mean, certainly aspects of that will be very quick, very immediate. In the first 100 days, we intend to at least offer the capabilities of direct deposit for town employees. The contract negotiations might take a little longer, but we'll have the capabilities and then online bill pay. Obviously, I will have a computer as mayor, which the current mayor has not had a computer that he's worked with. Email for town employees. I mean, these are a lot of basic things that we can do pretty early on, relatively low cost. In terms of getting all of town hall up to date, that means digitizing our land records, digitizing all of our records, getting each individual department with the 21st century technology that they need to do the jobs of the 21st century. That's going to take years, and that's why we have our campaign has proposed a 15-year or capital expenditure plan to repair the infrastructure needs that we currently have, while also leave room and leave a plan for these much-needed improvements and upgrades. 'Cause it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of grant money. It's going to take a lot of bonding. It's going to take a lot of forward thinking to do it in a fiscally responsible manner, and that's precisely what this campaign offers and what my candidacy is all about. So thank you very much again to Chris and Keith on that question. If I didn't get to any point of that you wanted me to, and this goes for anyone who has questions going forward, feel free to leave a new comment, and we can readdress it then. All right, I'll go to the next one here, which I mentioned. I knew there was a question on schools. What is your thought on combining the schools and the education budget in general? I see something here about how the schools and the Wallingford Public Schools allowed to have early dismissals for the whole first week of school, and how we could potentially change that. So I realize there's a couple of questions there in one, and that's from Danielle on Instagram. So thank you, Danielle, for asking that question, and it's important. So I'll preface this with, of course, in Wallingford, we do have a structure of government where we have our own Board of Education. a group of 9 elected officials who are also up for election this year, I should add, who have the ultimate say on how our schools are run and how that money is spent. Now, that being said, as mayor, I would have a very important role to play in that whole process, and the fact that their overall budget is set by the mayor. And that's a really important thing. About 2/3 of our town budget currently, which is not outside of the norm of most towns and cities across Connecticut. Certainly within that, though, there's also other ways that, because of the funding dynamic between the administration, the town council, and the Board of Ed, that we can play an important role, and I intend to play a very active role. So very quick, not trying to dodge the question, in terms of the my personal thoughts on the 2 high schools, I'm personally against that plan, with, again, the preface that the Board of Ed has the ultimate say on that because they decide how those dollars go. What I do intend to use my position to do is, again, advocate for the issues that many, at this point, over 10,000 residents that we've spoken to have said is their biggest concerns with either combining the 2 high schools, or even if they're for the high schools, combining what their primary priorities and concerns are for that process being correctly. And one of the things that I also am using my position for is to push as hard as I can the community to call for referendum. I think for something that's truly this big, the biggest decision, both financially and really culturally, societally, that our communities had to make in certainly my lifetime, I think voters should have a say. I think there's been some very legitimate, serious concerns with transparency throughout this process, and a referendum, which again would require 10% of registered voters to sign a petition, and then 20% of registered voters to actually show up the day of the vote, is legally binding here in Wallingford. So it is a way built into our charter to appropriately, give voters and residents the ability to have a really important say in how we spend our taxpayers' money and how the communities run. Now, in terms of the education budget, the reality of it is our education budget has been consistently over time underfunded. Now, it's not by exponential margins per se, but it's certainly, the budget this past year was cut by about $3 million, if I remember correctly, from what the Board of Ed is asking. And I think what's happened, because in the last at least 20 years, and I wouldn't say it's probably not the question that was the last 40 years, but I know for sure the last 20 years, the mayor has not fully funded what the Board of Ed has requested for spending. And so I think that's forced the Board of Ed to kind of overstate what they need, hoping to, basically this game of chicken that sometimes has worked out, many times, oftentimes has not, and this year clearly that needle was not thread. And I think a better relationship between a new mayor and the Board of Education and the superintendent would hopefully alleviate some of those funding gaps, because we should never be having situations like this year where in the same night you had the town council, including my opponent in this case, vote for a $35,000 increase for the salary of mayor, and then the very next vote to cut what's essentially about $3 million worth of funding, which at the time was included over 20 paraeducator positions, every first grade paraeducator being completely cut. And I think there's a huge disconnect there, that we're having those 2 votes back to back, and that the first one succeeded and the second one failed to advocate for these paraeducators and ultimately to advocate for our students. So I do vow to certainly increase to a reasonable extent the funding that the Board of Education has. But the bottom line is the Board of Ed could have double the money they have now, but if you don't have the right people in those elected positions on the Board of Ed side, it's not going to matter. So I really encourage folks to do their due diligence and look at the Board of Ed candidates we have this year. I'm really excited about a bunch of them, including a bunch of newcomers. So I know you can look at least at the Democratic candidates all on the same page, which is the Wallingford Democratic Town Committee's website. Got some really exciting candidates there with not just the expertise that position requires, but the real investment. They've had kids go through the system. They themselves have been educators, some of them both. So it's a really important that obviously this mayoral election will be important, but this Board of Ed election will be equally important. And lastly, because this has been a hot topic in the first semester for obvious reasons, is if you have children as students in the Wallingford public school system right now, you would have known that the first week of school had every single day was early dismissal because of the heat. And this is only going to happen more often with climate change and heat generally going up. Our school years, sometimes due to snow days as well, going longer and longer. This time it was on the front end. And it is avoidable. And I think that for us to just say that it's not avoidable is not a fair response to the question. To say that, okay, 60 years ago we didn't have these early dismissals. Well, 60 years ago most schools were half days anyway. I know when my grandfather went to Lyman Hall, it was a half day. You would go to school the first half of the day and you'd work the second half of the day. So those early dismissals wouldn't have applied anyway. And certainly it wasn't getting as hot for as long back then as it is now. So we live in this modern age. We have to adapt accordingly. And we missed a real opportunity to apply for state money and grants to pay for HVAC systems, so air conditioning in our schools. As far as I'm aware, none of our schools have full AC. Almost none of them have any kind of air conditioning in terms of central. And when this grant money existed this past year, it was $65 million, I think. It was a pretty tight turnaround time. But we don't have a full-time grant writer in Wallingford. And that killed us. Because our Board of Ed, there's a lot of folks on there that will do their best to apply for grants internally, but this is why the cities and towns that did apply and did get this money, keep in mind, many of which are wealthier than ours. I believe it was Fairfield, Danbury, a couple other towns and cities that got a lot of this grant money for air conditioning in their schools. We weren't at the table. It's because we didn't have a full-time grant writer to subsidize the work and the decisions that our Board of Ed made. And if you look at the reporting from that time, they literally said they were stretched too thin to apply to that grant. Now, this coming year, I believe this December again, is another tranche of over $50 million for air conditioning. As far as I'm aware, we haven't applied again, despite knowing about this one for over a year and a half. Now, there's still time, but this just goes to show why time and time again, Wallingford not only applies to fewer grants than any other town our size, but even the ones we do apply for, we're successful in a smaller percentage because we're having folks who do not specialize in grant writing write these grants, and we're having people that don't have the time to put the full amount of effort into writing these grants to make it the strongest application possible. So this is something that day one, or at least first 100 days, I plan to do in my administration to put out to bid, get a job description approved by the town council for a full-time grant writer, a position that when you hire the right person, pays for itself in the first week and 100-fold in the first year. So this is common sense. It should have been done many, many years ago, but we are where we are, and better late than never. So thank you for that question. I know it was a bit of a multi-part one, but it's important. I believe I only have more or less one question here from before we started tonight, and this is Andrea from Facebook. What makes you different than my opponent, Vincent Cervoni, and what makes you a better candidate? And in addition to that, and I'll try to hopefully I remember this part as well. Shannon will hold me accountable if I forget to answer this part. What will you do in your first 100 days in office? So your top 3 priorities in your first 100 days. Other than the obvious in terms of what makes me different from my opponent, I think it's very clear by, who handpicked him to succeed, and what his, co-opting the slogan of the current mayor, that this election's 2 options, right? It's an option of the continuation of the same last 40 years where not just one person, but really a core group, about the same dozen people have run this town. And I'll, push anyone to tell me where in the last 20 years that we've progressed or improved. And, in every measurable way we have declined in the last 20 years, whether it's the quality of our schools, whether it's our tax rates, whether it's our staffing, our infrastructure across the board. So I offer as my candidacy is a change, someone with a new perspective, someone right the ship. In a lot of ways, what Dickinson represented, Mayor Dickinson, when he first took office 40 years ago. He had never served elected office before. He was about my age. The one difference being that while Mayor Dickinson had not served in public service before, that's been my whole career. As a member of the Department of Justice and the Antitrust Division, criminal enforcement of the Antitrust Division, as one of the Lieutenant Governor's staff, to now a member of the United States Army Reserves, which I'm very proud of. I've dedicated my life, and I will continue to do so, regardless of the outcome of this election, to public service because it's something I care about. And that's ultimately what made me run for mayor in the first place 2 years ago when we got incredibly close. It wasn't so much that I saw an opportunity to run, although it certainly is, and I don't take that for granted. I'm very proud to be the Democratic candidate for mayor, both in 2021 and now. But I saw it more as, or equally so, as a moral obligation. This has always been my hometown. My parents live here. My siblings live here. My grandparents still live here, which I'm very fortunate to still have them in my life. And I felt like it was my obligation to do whatever I could to make my community the great community I know it can be. So I realize I deviated a little bit here, but back more specifically, what else makes us different not just, the difference between 40 years or a continuation of the same and someone different to right the ship. It's also, I think, what voters really need to ask themselves is who has a plan, right? Because when we can get into platforms, I think if you look at my opponent's platform, it's over time gotten very similar to a lot of overlap with mine. But I think the key difference is there is no plan with my opponent's platform. You can go, and this has gone against the better judgment of any political advice that I've inquired, because any political team or any other type of political race, the advice you'll get as a candidate is be vague. Sit on a fence as much as you can so that people can kind of paint onto you whatever they want to see. And we haven't done that. I haven't done that because I think voters are smarter than that, frankly, and residents have a right to know where I stand on issues. And that's why if you go on my website, which you can find through social media, it's o'connellct.com, you'll find my platform, my issues in probably too much detail because someone will surely always find something that they nitpick and don't like. But that's the difference between myself and my opponent is I have a very clearly laid out plan, a budget, a 15-year infrastructure plan, and all the things are flexible. I mean, there's an opportunity, certainly as soon as I take office, where we'll give the public every opportunity in the world to comment and have us, push us one way or the other in terms of where we want to adjust these timelines and these priorities. But this is where we are now, and I think it's important for people to realize the difference. And I think in that same note of having a plan, there's a difference between motive, right? I mean, I think the way that it's supposed to work, right, in terms of anyone who wants to seek elected office in a perfect world, at least for the right reasons, is that it's the ideas and platform that motivate you to then run to seek office, not the other way around. And I think that's another key difference between myself and my opponent. Before anyone knew that I was running back in 2021, I already had my website up with my platform on there. And we made adjustments here and there when the situations change. And of course, with the pandemic, a lot of situations change. But it was always there because it was those ideas that I knew I could make my town a better place that made me want to run. And that order of operations is important because, again, with my opponent, Chairman Cervoni, it was the opposite. He's been running for, I think he's been announced for about 7 months or so now. And his platform only became online 2 or 3 weeks ago, with it being almost a summary of my own platform, but without all the details. And I think that shows you, when you seek the office first and foremost, and the reasons for why you should be elected second, that to me is a problem. And I think that's something we shouldn't forget. So the reality is, and I don't want to make this very clear to folks, a lot of the things we talk about are going to take a long time. You can't go from 40 years of doing something the same way to all of a sudden flip of a switch and it's different, nor should it be like that. We're going to rely a lot on the institutional knowledge of a lot of the folks in town hall currently, and it's going to be a cooperative effort with the town council as well and the board of ed to start trending us in the right direction. Now, in the first 100 days specifically, it's not just getting our feet on the ground. We still obviously want to start running as well. So online bill pay is something that I vowed and promised to implement in the first 100 days so that people always still have the option of going to town hall and paying their bills in person or sending in the mail should they choose. But this way, having it so you don't have to go through a third party or pay a fee through a bank or a credit union, that you can pay directly through the town website to the town, your tax bills, your electric bills, your water bills. Something that, again, every other town, city in the state of Connecticut does. Should have been done a long time ago. And it would save, not only is it a convenience factor, but it would save the town a little bit of money because people we've seen, there's plenty of proof of this, that people are more consistent with paying their bills on time when given that convenience option. A bigger part in terms of the fiscal thing that we're going to do in the fiscal dynamic of things, I should say, in the first 100 days, but on a similar note, is direct deposit. So direct deposit, I don't think folks realize how much the fact that we don't have direct deposit costs us. I think unless you know someone who works for the town, which I assume many of us do if we don't ourselves work for the town, are still blown away that we don't have direct deposit. Because it's really just a standard of even the end of the 20th century, let alone the 21st century. The town just purchased another 50,000 checks a week or two ago, which isn't free. The stamps alone for pensioners, from when you have to mail those checks to them, which they could be anywhere in the world, let alone just in Wallingford. These things add up to, we estimate, about $200,000 a year. Okay, and that's only a piece of the puzzle. The other piece that I don't think a lot of people realize is that many of our town employees are on contracts that, because they're on still this very antiquated pick up your paycheck system, where they have paid 30 minutes leave every week or every pay period to go to the credit union, to go to town hall, or go wherever they collect their checks, to go do that. Now, keep in mind, this is not something that the employees want to do. It's not something the unions want. They've been trying to negotiate direct deposit for a long time. But if you were to do the math on the lost work hours that are paid, just do that. And this is harder to calculate because obviously every person on a slightly different contract and gets paid slightly differently. But we estimate that's anywhere from another $100,000 plus. So we're talking about $300,000 per year, which sure in a $186 million budget is a drop, but it's annual and it adds up, and it's one of the examples of where these efficiencies are important. And then the last thing for the first 100 days is we've talked about, so I realize I'm ranting out a little bit, so I'll be very quick about this, is that 15-year infrastructure plan. We want to come right forward to the public. I'll probably do more of these Q&As, and they might be hours long, and that's totally fine, however long it takes, to bring the plan to the public, give them ample opportunity in as many ways possible to comment, point out their issues with it, point out their suggestions, so that we have that input before we really start to put that plan into place. And that's what we're going to try to do. So I think that's all I have for right now with these questions. So I'll pass it over to Shannon if she wants to send me or tell me a new one.
Yes, I have a couple for you. Another question that I got is, what is your position on open space management?
I'm going to guess that's my good friend Ken that might have asked that.
It was indeed him,
okay,
yes.
good. No, it's a good question. It's a really good question. I was very happy with the town council actually last night, which I don't say often, but I will certainly give him credit in this case, for really having no opposition to an agenda item last night to purchase, I'm blanking off the exact number, I think it was 60-something acres of land along our watershed to the water division to protect that land. Certainly preserving, conserving open space for public use, for just keeping parts of Wallingford have its rural context, rural texture. In addition to that, farmland is certainly something that's very important to me. I used to live over on Northford Road by the Mackenzie Reservoir, and part of the reasons I loved that space, not just because we had miles and miles of Tyler Mill where I could walk my dog twice a day, and did twice a day because it wasn't up to me, it was up to him. Open space is a really important part of Wallingford that we need to protect, and especially we're in a unique position to do so, given the fact that we do have our own water division who knows how to maintain these spaces in the way that best protect our watershed for the distant future. Now, I do think we have to also be creative, right? Because as a municipality, we can't, nor should we ever be able to, just go to a private landowner, assuming that they're within the bounds of their own zoning and regulations, and say, you can't sell your property to so-and-so because we want to keep a farm. You know, I've had a lot of family that grew up in Wallingford on farms and worked on farms and owned farms, and a lot of those farmlands are no longer farms. They've been sold, they've been developed. This is over the past 100 years, right? But we want to, like I said, we have to find creative ways to kind of combat that trend towards unrestricted development, because we don't want that. And I think one of the ways that we've talked about in the past, and I'd love to pursue further, is using these spaces in a way that we can keep them open, keep them, like I said, undeveloped in the traditional sense, in the industrial sense, while giving these landowners an opportunity to still make them economically viable if farming, for whatever reason, in that area has not been viable anymore. That's the only way we can protect this land in the long run. In addition to state grants that can buy up open space, that's a separate thing. And I think a way to do it is looking into renewable energy, specifically solar. And a lot of these open spaces where the acreage goes way past where you can even see from the trails or the roads, small solar developments or battery developments allow us to make that land extremely profitable without having to actually change any of the ecosystem or the farm setting in any way, shape, or form, and without being disruptive to any residents. I think on top of that, we're in a very unique position, being one of only, I believe, 3 municipalities left in Connecticut that still controls our own municipal electric division, So by having another way to generate power, which we don't really do anymore, nor does it make sense for us to generate power in the traditional sense, this is an opportunity to reduce the strain on our grid, to elongate the time before we have to, make costly upgrades to our grid and our power lines and our transformers and everything else. But it also, we profit from it, right? Because by producing our own electricity basically in-house in Wallingford, it brings our already competitive rates even lower. So I'd love to explore that opportunity as another way for us to get back into that really forward-thinking, front of the line innovation of being back in the business of power generation as a way of conserving our environment and our open space. And I think that'd be really cool to see. And I think that's what the next big thing that could really transform Wallingford is.
All right. And another question that we got was, where do you stand on the sewer and water plants? Because you do talk a lot about the electric division and the struggle that it's going through right now. So where do you stand on the sewer and the water plants?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll be honest, that's certainly on me a little bit it's understated, I think, the challenges that water and sewer have. We have a phenomenal water and sewer division in terms of our staff and employees and what they're trying to achieve every single day. But like pretty much all of our other public utilities, and in some ways more than any other public utility, they're really experiencing a real severe staffing crisis as well. I actually, before we did this, I was just coming from down the street at Wallingford Center Inc. and Hubcap, a municipal job fair where we had great attendance. I mean, over 100 people coming to apply for these jobs, which is great. This should become an annual thing. This is the first time I think we've ever done one, at least in that space. With that many people, and I would love to see that become a regular, not just yearly thing, but a quarterly thing, especially when we're having these staffing shortages. But that's not alone enough, right? We have to make sure, and this applies to all of our town employees, but especially these really technical jobs in our public utilities, and that's supporting our employees. I mean, these are the folks that supply us our water, electricity, keep the roads open, and even especially in times of emergency. I mean, these are people that protect us in no stretch of the imagination. And we have not been returning that favor. We have cut pensions. We've removed the traditional pension plan from all of these employees, which was the main thing keeping them here. Their wages are a fraction of what they would make elsewhere, and not just privately, but in other towns. Their benefits have been cut, and there's a real top-down micromanagement issue and not open-door policy coming from town hall. So these are all everything from cultural to financial that we're focused on addressing in my administration. Certainly one of the things I'm promising to do is reevaluate and we can talk about pension fund another time because it's kind of in depth, but our pension fund's poorly managed, can do better, and by doing better with investment, we can reoffer a traditional predefined benefit plan to our employees once again. In terms of the water sewer division itself, other than staffing, I think that's the biggest thing. I know we went a long period of time without having a water, I'm going to botch the name of the title, so I apologize, but basically a water testing engineer of some sort, because there was no one to do the job and someone got sick. So these are the kind of things we can't be, when it comes to critical parts of our community and infrastructure, like I said, electricity, water, sewer, and public works. Mayor Dickinson always had a great quote where he said, the main job of the town is to keep the lights on, which I think is a little simplistic, but right now we're struggling to necessarily do that in case of emergency, and same goes with water. So long-winded way of saying I'm very proud of our water and sewer division, that we have one, and I think the employees are fantastic, but we need to make sure we're doing more to support them in their mission.
All right. I run your social media and, see all the comments and all the questions throughout the day. A big one that I always see is that when you become mayor, you're just going to raise taxes, period. Like that's what you're going to do. So a question was, is that true? Like, are you looking to raise the taxes? And how is that different than how it's been with our current administration?
No, that's a great question, and it's the most often one I get it towards as well, and it's an important one because in addition to keeping the town safe and giving local businesses and residents the opportunity to succeed, the number one most important responsibility of any municipality is keeping the town affordable, keeping living here affordable. And I do think we are not succeeding, at least not in the extent we should, in that category. So just to set the scene, Wallingford is one of, if not the only town in Connecticut right now, that's had 18 straight years of proposed tax increases from the administration. That's 18, that spans 2 recessions. In the last 3 years, where the cost of living was through the roof, inflation was over 6%, cost of groceries, cost of gas were insane. Instead of lowering the tax rate, we increased it, and we had a reevaluation. So some people are paying upwards of 60% more in their cars just in a 2-year period for their property tax. And we added over $3 million, I believe, to our rainy day fund in that same amount of time. So by definition, we are overtaxing people. So let's start with there. The reality is your taxes have gone up for 18 years. Another key part of that is no, the bottom line is, for the first time, not only will I not be part of that, for the first time in 18 years, I will not raise taxes. I'm vowing to lower taxes, or at the very least freeze taxes in the next several budgets. Now, it's great that I can say that. Obviously, no one likes taxes, but the important part is how. And we've already talked about some of it tonight. I mean, a lot of these efficiencies that we're talking about, just from talking about 21st century practices, from having the communication software with the town, emails and everything else, to having direct deposit, online bill pay. These will help. But by far the biggest components, grant writers, full-time grant writer. If you look at, off the top of my head, I think two towns that are comparable in size, I believe Middletown and East Hartford are both within 4,000 or so population of our 45,000. I believe Middletown's, I might get the two mixed up, but one of them's receiving over $300 million in state grants over the next 2 years. The other one is receiving over $200 million. Wallingford's receiving about $60-something million. And these grants are not tied to average income, which those towns are about comparable to Wallingford anyway, average household income. We're not at the table. We're not applying for these grants. And I know I talked about a lot, but full-time grant writer is going to play a huge role, because that's hundreds of millions of dollars that we're leaving on the table. And it was even more in federal money back when we had our Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro as chair of appropriations. We missed that opportunity because we did not have a forward-looking administration. So that's another thing that's going to change. And without getting too much in the technicalities of it, because I know I lose a lot of people, but I am really passionate about it, is our pension investments, right? So the $30 million in the Rainy Day Fund, I think it's bloated. I'm not planning on cutting back on it significantly, but I'm certainly not going to add to it, because that money cannot be invested. By state statute, it sits there, right? So unless we're using it, it loses millions of dollars of value each year just in inflation. The pension fund, however, now we're talking about $245 million about. And it averaged over the last 20 years, I think 5% returns, which is, for context, the market's averaged 11.5%, 12% returns in that time. So if you do that to $250 million almost, you're talking about $20 million a year, more than $20 million a year difference, and it's cumulative. So over the course of, let's say, 10 years, you're talking about over $300 million that we don't have today, simply because we invest like it's still the 1980s. Happy to have a whole separate show on the pension fund. I know on WPAA as well, I spoke on Citizen Mike show, Mike Brinsky's show, so feel free to take a look at that on YouTube as well, because we talked a lot about the pensions, but that's a huge part of why we need a fresh perspective. These are common sense solutions to common sense problems, and the only thing limiting our ability to do it is someone coming in there with a fresh perspective, and that's what I hope to do. So thank you. Next question.
Jason Michael, actually one of the candidates with you on the ballot, asked, can you touch on your views concerning the current levels of transparency and accountability, and what you will do to improve them?
Sure. Well, thank you for joining tonight, Jason. As Shannon said, one of our town council candidates who is a phenomenal candidate. And unfortunately, I think has experienced firsthand our failure as a town to be transparent in a lot of ways. I think back to a committee that Jason served on for a long time, the subcommittee of the Park and Rec Committee on the community pool and its renovation and reopening, and how it became very clear over time that the current administration wanted nothing to do with that project. But because there was a lack of openness about it, because there was a lack of transparency about it, we spent $500,000 in taxpayer dollars on a project that was never going anywhere. And now we've been fighting for 3 years just to even put back out to bid. So that's just off the top of my head. When you said Jason asked it, that's what came to mind. But across the board, I mean, as I said at the town council meeting last night, we had other issues with transparency when it came to I know they had the town risk manager there talking about aspects of the building maintenance committee report. And there were the aspects of that were simply untrue in terms of how long these issues have been there, whether or not they've been reported, etc. I can point to a million other examples, and the reality is that we cannot succeed as a town or as a community unless we're all operating off of the same fundamental information. And this is a greater issue in the country right now, frankly. I love having these conversations on social media because it allows us to reach a lot of people. But social media is also where misinformation gets spread a lot, and it makes it more difficult to have these conversations with the right information. I mean, you go back 10, 20 years, And the differences between me and my opponent would be about how we're going to solve these issues. But instead, I'm spending most of my time disagreeing about whether or not these issues even exist. We had 30% staffing in electric division. My opponent refused to acknowledge that and accept that. I refuse to accept it, but I accept the fact that it's true, just not accept the fact that that's standard or acceptable levels. And I think, again, this speaks to a greater issue that we're facing in general. But something certainly that I vow to do is open transparency. And that's why I want to propose all my plans. That's why I have all my details on my website. I mean, again, we're not just saying it. I really think we're showing it. We're demonstrating that everything we're trying to accomplish is transparent. And this also brings me back to our town council and board of ed candidates, and like I've said, town council candidate Jason Michael. These are separate entities. For the first time in probably ever in Wallingford history, at least as far back as I could find, in one election, we are going to decide a new chairman of the council, a new chair of the board of education, and a new mayor. So basically all three of the local branches of government, if you want to call them that, are going to turn over. And that's an exciting opportunity, but it means we can't let that opportunity pass us by, because each one of these bodies has their own rules on public comment, on actually how they interact with the public. And you can see a big difference between opportunities for public comment with the mayor's office, with the town council and board of ed, and frankly all three leave a lot to be desired. So I'll say it, I've said it once, I'll say it again, and I'll probably say it at least one more time before tonight's over. Really look at these town council and board of ed elections this year as well, and vote for candidates that that even if they might disagree with you on an issue here or there, because you'll never, no reasonable people will always agree on everything all the time, but you want to know that they'll be open and transparent about the process and give you, as a voter and a member of the public, an opportunity to comment on it yourself as well. So
I think that's one of the biggest issues. Like, as I run your social media and see all that kind of stuff, it is a lot of spreading of the misinformation and trying just to state facts, and then it's almost always turned around into something negative. So
right, and I think I'll add one more point to that too, is that some of the misinformation is usually harmless, like he still lives with his parents or something, which I don't, but it's harmless information. When we talk about policy, and again, I don't put too, I do value the fact that we're able to communicate with voters and residents through social media, like I said, but I don't put, when it comes to misinformation, that I don't take too much interest in it. But when it comes to misinformation from a more organized perspective, right, from a policy perspective, that's where we tread the dangerous waters. So you're absolutely right.
Definitely. Another question from our friend Bill on Facebook. Will you consider adding an arborist to Public Works and a sidewalk inspector that actually ceased in 1999 as being a job?
Right. He stole my thunder there by saying the year. But,
yeah.
But no, yeah. So a lot of these, we've had a real problem with positions that existed long ago slowly disappearing, right? So it's in our charter, for instance, to have a town treasurer. By charter law, we need to have a town treasurer with specific responsibilities. I believe we're going on 8 years now without a town treasurer, and the last time someone asked the mayor about it is, we're still reviewing job applications, obviously, is in jest. So these build up, right, where jobs that are critical haven't been done. In a very serious note, our sidewalks. Our sidewalks are in horrific shape across the board. And it's not Public Works' fault. The Public Works employees are doing all they can. I mean, they're understaffed, they're under-resourced, and they have a million different projects on their hands. But we haven't had a sidewalk inspector since 1999, so we don't have a really modern, efficient way for residents, whether, I'd love to see it be done by an app, or you can just submit an email or something like that to the proper channels to report when there's a problem. Because right now we have people who are, whether they're wheelchair bound or whether they're just pushing a stroller or whether they're recovering from an injury, are tripping, are injuring themselves. I know I can barely count on two hands how many people I know that have broken bones on Wallingford sidewalks. And just last year we had a tragedy where someone who was on an electric wheelchair, passed away because they were on the road because the sidewalk would not support their wheelchair, and they were hit by a car and killed. So these things are critical positions that we certainly, the arborist is another great example. We have widowmakers, they call them, these branches that are hanging over sidewalks and public spaces, where there's no arborists to check these and to address them before tragedy strikes. We have to change, and not just change, go back to, because at one point we had all these positions, go back to a time where we could be proactive about serious safety and health concerns. Now, don't even start about the old train station, but serious safety and health concerns. Because right now we're not there, and a lot of these positions that we're talking about, sidewalk inspector, arborist, are a step in the right direction to address these serious concerns.
All right. Another question we have from Matt is, are you open for a trolley service from the old train station uptown? That was something that was showed in a recent picture from back in the day. Sure. And I think it really sparked the idea of like a quaint small town. So what are your ideas about that?
So I love that idea. I'll be honest, I have not heard that one before, although I think I did see the same photo that this individual saw. I don't know, I'll be honest with you, I'm not an expert by any means on this, but I don't know if our modern infrastructure, the direction we want to go with our modern infrastructure, would necessarily support a trolley service. I mean, I lived in D.C. for years in Georgetown, where they had removed all their trolleys after decades. But I will tell you on that same note, whether it's a trolley or something else, we do seriously need to address the lack of quality of public transportation in Wallingford. There's certain bus routes that are extremely limited. I know in certain sectors of town, the bus stops are very far away. There's no cover. So in the middle of winter, in the middle of a rainstorm, you're getting absolutely pelted. Some of them don't even have a bench. You're just off the side of the highway, basically. And these are how people get to work. I mean, and some of these buses, I might have mentioned also, I think they only run from 10 to 3. And I'm thinking to myself, how is someone going to hold a 9 to 5? Especially all the folks that need the bus are people that are trying to hold on to a steady job and make an income. You can't hold on to a 9 to 5 like that, especially if it's odd hours. So the whole system, and this obviously is done in conjunction with the state, needs to be reevaluated. I also think, while I'm strongly against this right now, but should it happen, or should they find a new space or a better space for adult ed, until that happens, I'm not in favor of anything happening with their current space. But should that happen, we need to make sure, and even should it not happen, I'd love to see public transportation supplement these great programs that we already have in town, whether it's the Future of Community Pool, whether it's our great adult ed program, to make them more accessible to as many people as possible, but especially the folks that need it most. So a trolley, if we can get that to work, and again, I'd have to see what experts think. I think that'd be beautiful.
This person wanted to, first of all, thank you for using WPAA-TV tonight.
Well, let's thank you, WPAA, for having us tonight, first and foremost. We're happy to be here.
And will you review the use of resources for government TV at Fairfield Boulevard, a space that has not been used for several years?
Absolutely. I think when it comes to government TV in particular, there has been years long now of underfunding going as far as defunding. I mean, positions like what we just talked about, the sidewalk inspector and the arborist, have disappeared as people have retired. And it's one thing when positions disappear because technology advances and for efficiency reasons, and when someone retires, you don't necessarily need to fill them in. But that's not what happened here. I mean, the services that something like government TV can offer have dropped now to where it would have been years ago. And it becomes very important when it comes to that transparency issue we were talking about. We've had issues where pretty dramatic statements and concerns have been brought up at committee meetings, whether it was the police steering committee early this year, or new police station steering committee, or the Public Utilities Commission. These used to be filmed, and they were filmed for a good reason, because it gave people the opportunity, residents, to tune in and make sure you were keeping an eye on how the town was being run and what the issues were. Because they weren't filmed, we still had minutes, but very few people get to see those minutes. It makes it much harder to understand. I mean, even if you just I'm sure if you took a transcript of what I said tonight, and my little going back and forth and run-on sentences, it'd make a lot less sense than hearing me speak now. So you can't understate the importance of these things. And whether it's a combination of WPA, which is a great service to the community in the services they offer and supporting them, in addition to government TV, which does an essential service in covering our commissions, and once offering their own shows as well many, many decades ago at Fairview Boulevard. These are all things that we need to look at and improve how we fund, because without them, there's no there's no window to peer into the inner workings of government unless we have these services, especially with the, local stations always at risk everywhere, local publications, now the Record Journal is down to 5 or 6 days a week. We need this extra perspective, extra window, so that people can stay informed, because democracy only works when people are informed, right? And that's partially why we do things like this tonight. So great question.
And another question off of Facebook from Ray. He wanted to know how you can do all of this. So all these ideas that you're having and changes that you want to bring to the town, how can you do all this and keep taxes down? Like, where are the cost savings not currently explored?
Yeah, so I won't rehash too much of it because I know we'll post this video in its entirety online after, and I know we talked a lot about how our plan does not raise taxes. A couple things I didn't mention is it's order of operations first, right? So the timeline to do all these things will be determined by where are we at if we freeze the mill rate first, right? So say we freeze the mill rate now, that still gives us about, based on previous histories and expected increases in costs from increase in salaries, inflation, everything else, that still gives about $2 to $3 million to work with just by leaving the mill rate where it is per year. That's not enough, but it's a good start. Then we focus on a lot of the issues we already talked about that are I like to call the fastest or highest rate of return investments. So that's the things that are relatively low cost or quick to implement and have a quick rate of return. So like we talked about with direct deposit, with online bill pay, with certain infrastructure investments that, again, would raise property values, etc. So that's where they focus, in addition to how we save our funds with the pension fund situation. I think people focus too much on the rainy day fund. It is bloated, but we're talking $20 million plus a year on the pension fund that we're losing, which you can do a ton with that. And then hundreds of millions, well, not per year, but you're talking about, I'll take it back, potentially over $100 million a year in grants that we are not present for. So all these things combine to accomplish what we're talking about. But the bottom line is you start by setting a budget that does not raise taxes. You do it with what you can within those bounds, within those restrictions, and then that gives you the ability. And again, these are all short. We're talking about several years, and then we'll have a better idea of where the investments have taken us. But it's that order of operations that'll determine the timeline of, okay, so how long is it going to take us to pay for these infrastructure investments, or not pay for them necessarily, but to start them in different capacities. So great question.
And I think you acknowledged this in the beginning, but this week is Senior Week, where we're doing a lot of events, for the senior citizens of Wallingford. And I think some of the things that I've seen on Facebook, a lot of people try to say that you're only focusing on bringing new families in. During the Senior Week and, all the weeks moving forward, how are you going to assist and help and focus focus on the seniors that live in Wallingford?
A great question. So I think a lot of this comes up partially because people see me, I look even younger than I am, I'm told. So I think that's part of it. But I think another part of it is a misinterpretation of what our slogan means, right? So our slogan in 2021, it's our slogan in 2023 for a reason. Our future. Now, for our future doesn't just mean the future of my generation or the generation after me or anything like that. That certainly plays an important part of it, but it's also for the future for people in my parents' generation who have, some of whom have lived in Wallingford the whole time, some of them moved here for work. It's the future of my grandparents' generation who have never lived anywhere else other than Wallingford, but it's become increasingly difficult for a lot of these folks to stay here because of the price of taxes. Connecticut's not the cheapest place to live either. So the fundamental point for our future is we're talking about everybody's future. Ultimately, we're talking about the town's future, which everyone plays an important role in. In terms of the issues that have always been part of our platform, but because of that, like you said, I think people miss out on, especially when you talk on social media, we're only hitting sometimes a certain demographic, which is why I'm grateful to have this opportunity to talk on WPAA as well, that there's certain issues that are more directly impactful, I should say, for our seniors, and that's why we really need to address them. So we have more seniors living in Wallingford today than ever. We've seen, I recently spoke to the fire chief, and actually the fire department and the police department discussed this at the municipal job fair earlier before we had this today, that a lot of these calls now that they're dealing with are going to seniors living in houses in Wallingford where they don't have either the resources or the support network to always be safe. And I think that's one level of what we're trying to do for seniors and what I'd love to see do with our first responders. We are very fortunate in Wallingford that we have a great fire department. We have great firefighters, EMTs, firefighter paramedics, and we have great police officers who respond to a lot of these emergencies. And I'd love to give them the training and funding they need to make sure that they're trained in things like how to deal with a call for a dementia patient or an Alzheimer's patient or other types of ailments that require unique perspective and trainings to deal with in the most effective way possible, because we're seeing more and more calls like that every year. I'd love to see for a lot of our senior housing or just non-market housing in town, some of our public housing as well, where it is a much older population generally. They don't currently have a system set up where if one of them has an emergency, for them to directly reach out to first responders. I know they used to, but a lot of that was cut off. So I believe now for most of our housing facilities, if you fall down, there's a button you can hit or something that'll just turn a light on your door, but then you're kind of at the mercy of your neighbors to help you out. And it's great that it's worked so far where the community's been able to help each other out, but we can make sure we're doing our job as a municipality too. Like I said before, number one job is to keep people safe. And not that we're not doing that, but I think we can improve upon it. And on that housing note in general, I think this speaks to everyone, but especially seniors, especially folks on a fixed income, I should say as well. It has become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to find affordable places to live. You will have people who have lived here their whole lives, had good paying jobs, raised a family, but with people living longer now, you could be on a fixed income for decades, and it becomes unsustainable when you also have these tax increases. Like I said, if you've had 18 years in a row of tax increases, so nearly 2 decades, 2 recessions, so who knows how your Social Security and investments are doing, and or your 401k investments are doing, and not to mention the reevaluations and the inflation and everything else, price of groceries. The odds are stacked against you, or even if you saved what you thought you would need, you might have needed 4 times as much as we originally thought. So I'm committed to investing in really expanding, and it's going to take years, but it's important, expanding our non-market rate senior housing so that there are places for people to go. Because I know a lot of seniors who born and raised in Wallingford, they'll never move anywhere else, no matter what. And right now, there's nowhere else for them to go here. So we have great facilities like Masonic here in Ashler Village, especially with Masonic here in Ashler. But while being great facilities, they're not in everyone's price range. So we need to do more on the municipal side to build those public-private partnerships and create these opportunities for folks. And I think, and the last thing, too, comes to senior tax freezes, senior tax credits, etc. I know the Committee on Aging has met recently and proposed to the town council, or is still discussing with the town council about how can we build upon and expand the range of people that would qualify for these tax credits or tax reductions. I think bottom line, like I said, our main goal is to reduce and freeze taxes for everybody, which would solve this problem to start with. But beyond that, as time goes on, I think we certainly need to reevaluate who qualifies for those. So Wallingford wouldn't be the great town it is today if it wasn't for folks like my great-grandparents, my grandparents, parents, and everyone else who has made Wallingford their home and decided to raise their family here. And I think we owe it to those folks to make sure that they can continue to stay here and live full lives here after giving this town everything. And that's a big part of what we're talking about this week. I'm looking forward, like I said, to talk a lot more about that tomorrow.
Another question from Jean on Facebook. Certain areas of Route 5 are extremely unattractive. This is the main vein of our town that out-of-town folks see. Do you have any plans to improve how essentially the entrance to our town looks?
Sure, yeah, great question. So it's always a little tricky, right, along Route 5, because now we're dealing with a state road, right? So there's certain limitations, but even within that, it gives us a lot of opportunities to be creative. I think a big part of it is how we promote ourselves, right? So we've had a lot of difficulty developing some of these areas into whether it's as residencies or as businesses. And I think part of that comes to having a pretty in-depth plan for how we want these parts of town to look. We certainly, I know it was just discussed at the town council meeting last night, but we need to relook at the incentive programs in place for these things. And it comes down to a lot of requiring a lot of public-private partnerships, like I was saying, which is always difficult to accomplish and complicated because, it's 2 completely different sectors coming together. But that's what it's going to take to redevelop that downtown. Now I am feeling very optimistic these days because we have an incredible, very active Quinnipiac Chamber of Commerce. We have an incredible, very active Wallingford Center Inc. Focused on developing these downtown areas along Route 5 as well. And an EDC that has some great people who I think needs a little more direction from Town Hall in terms of technology and outreach. But the elements are all there. At the end of the day, Wallingford foundationally has everything needed to be a great town. I don't think it's an overstatement at all. And I fully believe this when I say this, Wallingford has the single highest potential of any town in the state of Connecticut, bar none. The problem is we are very much underperforming where we should be. And I think certainly the fact that we have multiple highway access points is great for an economy. The fact that we have our own electric division, the fact that we have our own water sewer, the variety of industry and business, everything else, all the parts are there. And what we're really focused on is capitalizing on what we do well and how we can address the needs of certain areas, like you said, like the areas around Route 5. At the end of the day, we're going to want public comment on all these places as well, because different parts of Route 5 have very different issues. And that's become very apparent as I've been out door knocking over 10,000 doors of the campaign now, that every part of town has their own challenges. And we're trying to open those lines of communication to address those issues.
A little over 2 minutes left in the broadcast, and another question came up again of wanting transparency. And, we did talk about being on here and being available is part of that transparency. But I just wanted to give you that opportunity for the last 2 minutes to kind of just wrap up and kind of let the citizens know more about you.
Thank you all for joining tonight. Look, the bottom line is I'm running to be mayor of Wallingford because I love this town, and I saw the challenges that we face, and that's what made me come back to this town and run for mayor in the first place. And despite the fact that we talk about all these challenges we're facing tonight, these are important issues, so I'm glad we have spaces like this to really go in depth, and I really appreciate all of you who participate tonight, and we'll do these every month. We'll continue to do these, maybe even more than every month now that we're 6 weeks away from the election. But we value your input, and thank you very much for participating, because otherwise I would just be out here with no questions, just kind of awkwardly staring into a camera. Before I forget, now that we are 6 weeks away, less than 6 weeks away, no matter what, make sure you vote, right? There's 6 weeks left.
Okay.
Register to vote. And the biggest problem Wallingford has is a disparity between who participates in local elections and who participates in these national and state elections. And we're one of the best when it comes to the even year elections, those national and state, over 80% turnout most of the time for federal, over 60% for state. For local, we hover around 40, many times less than 40%. And that creates a level of non-accountability, right? As we've seen in recent years, and unfortunately in recent months, special interests have a lot more strength when those running for elected office only have to depend on 20% or less of the public to vote them in. So whether or not you vote for me, I hope you vote for me, but whether or not you do, make sure you vote, make sure your neighbors vote, make sure your family votes, and make sure we have a record high turnout for this once in a generation, once in a lifetime probably, election coming in Wallingford this year. So I thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time, and we look forward to hopefully doing this again. And thank you again to WPAA for letting us reach as many people as possible.
Susan and Solomon helping us back
behind
the camera right now. So thank you to you guys, and thanks to everyone on Facebook and Instagram for sending in your stories.
Look forward to being here again. So thank you very much, and have a good night, everybody.
Bye.